I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. Ethiopia is one of the most consequential states on the African continent. With more than 130 million people, one of the largest armies in Africa, and a critical role as a supplier of low-cost power, developments in Ethiopia reverberate far beyond its borders. At the center of the country's story is its Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed. Today, we are fortunate to welcome Tom Gardner, the Economist, East Africa correspondent, and author of The Abiy Project, God, Power, and War in the New Ethiopia. Foreign Affairs called the book essential reading, while the LA Review of Books described it as groundbreaking. The book is a critical read for anyone seeking to understand this fascinating country and its shape-shifting leader. We are pleased to welcome Tom Gardner to Earlylands in Conversation. Well, Tom, thank you very much for joining us today. Where are we catching you at? Nairobi, I presume?
Yes, I'm in Nairobi, exactly.
How long have you been there with The Economist?
Well, I've been in Nairobi actually for just over a year. I was based in Ethiopia for The Economist in between 2016 and 2022. Maybe we'll get onto this. I got kicked out in 2022 and was back in the UK for a couple of years, during which I wrote a book, and then I moved out here in 2024.
Well, I think that is a good way to launch into why you find yourself in Nairobi as opposed to Addis. But you've been reporting for a long time, and Africa has been your beat. I think our listeners are always interested in career progression of our guests. So tell us how you came into Africa, East Africa, and Ethiopia in particular as your area of interest, and just give us a little bit of a walk through your career journey.
Sure. I mean, I had an interest in African history and politics going back to university, but Ethiopia in particular was where I started out as a journalist, firstly as a freelance journalist, although always writing for The Economist as well. And Ethiopia this was 2016 when I moved there. It was, in my view, this big underreported story. It was often seen as the kind of China of Africa. It had this exciting industrialization journey that it was embarking upon. At the scale of everything, the kind of the government at the time, and actually today, still kind of deals in superlatives. So it was building Africa's largest dam, it has the biggest army, the largest social housing project, whatever it is, it's always the biggest. So in that respect, I was drawn to it. And of course, there's Ethiopian Airlines, the kind of premier airline on the continent, and it was a hub as a result, a regional hub. It has the African Union, has the UN's Economic Commission, but Africa's based there, so it's kind of diplomatic, capital of the region, I guess always jostling and competing with Nairobi. Ethiopia felt, and maybe to this day still feels like an undercovered story, so I wanted to go there at a time which felt like, and it was proven correct, felt like a historic moment in that country's history.
Did you find it easy to embed yourself as a Western journalist in a country that has traditionally been a bit suspect, particularly of the Western press?
It was considerably easier then than it is now. I mean,
of course.
I think I went there assuming it might be almost impossible to set up there, that the government was hostile to foreign journalists. And I mean, there was bureaucratic obstacles, and government ministers, officials are not always that keen to talk to the media. But on the whole, it was really quite easy back then. And the great thing was you could travel all over the country. It's a huge country, a beautiful country, and there are stories in every corner of it. And I was able to do that for a long time. Unfortunately, that isn't the case now, but back then it was very exciting. And Ethiopia has this reputation as being kind of a closed book, and a certain suspicion of foreigners that is a product of this distinctive history. The only country in Africa, if you exclude Liberia, never to have been colonized, famously defeated the Italians in the late 19th century. So it has this distinctive history, a very strong sense of itself, and particularly in Addis and the kind of highland core, very strong sense of national identity, which is to some degree can be defined as kind of against outsiders. And
Right,
so,
right.
yeah, that was always there, but I wouldn't say at the beginning I didn't feel it. Didn't feel it too strongly.
Right.
It's certainly a country, and I report on countries all around the region. It's certainly a country where the responses to articles are always the most intense.
You're talking about that sort of calm before the storm period of 2015, 16, 17. I was there a number of times in that period, and it did feel like the country was open, pretty much you could go everywhere. And now I look at the map and places that I went as a tourist, which are now completely off limits or have suffered horribly during recent bouts of fighting. It does sound like you came at a very interesting point. Well, let's transition to talk a bit about the book, the Abiy Project, God, Power, and War in the New Ethiopia. First of all, I can't recommend it more highly. It's such a fascinating book. Like you say, it's a country that's underreported, but you have pulled the veil back in so many respects. But tell us about when it was that you felt, okay, this is a story that needs to be told. Abe, for example, won the Nobel Prize, and there was a narrative about him that was very different than I think what it is now. So tell us how you got to the point in which you felt there is a book here to be written.
To be honest, I would say really early on. It wasn't so much about Abiy the figure, but about the democratic transition. I think really from very early on in 2018, I was conscious that this was a kind of epochal moment. And it had a sort of revolutionary feeling in the air. I remember traveling around southern Ethiopia with my editor at the time, Africa editor from The Economist, and we
Right.
were, and it was extraordinarily colorful. You had the flags and the colors of all the different liberation movements which had been invited back by Abiy in this kind of big watershed moment of kind of liberal opening. Um, and it was and I remember we were in Hawassa in the south, and we kind of popped into the kind of city museum, and we were suddenly overwhelmed by the followers of a Sidama liberation movement, a particular liberation movement down there, arriving in their busloads, kind of chanting, blaring horns, music, and that was just kind of really characteristic of the time. But it was also, as with any revolution, I think, had this really dark underbelly, which was very apparent from early on. And I think that was something which obviously the in the Western media, I think, was often lost. I tried
Right.
to kind of emphasize it as much as I could in my reporting, but it often did get lost, and hence the come on to this with the Nobel Prize in 2019 that Abiy received, was somewhat blind to the fact that, yes, there were these really positive changes that appeared to be happening, but at the same time, you had millions of people being displaced in ethnic violence, land disputes in various parts of the country. Essentially, Ethiopia had the strongest state, probably certainly in the immediate region. I'm arguably one of
And
the strongest states on the continent, and it was clearly unraveling. The state was losing its monopoly on violence, and this was something that I thought was really, really significant. We're thinking about people were talking about Ethiopia as the kind of Yugoslavia of Africa and how it could unravel. That kind of sense of the kind of historic import was something I was conscious of pretty early. So I actually spoke to my publisher, Hearst, really early on at the end of 2018. So the kind of,
sure.
less than a year after Abiy came to power, and said I wanted to write about the transition. But back then it was still the kind of the loose pitch was something, democratic revolution or something like that. However conscious I was that it was really fast going in a different direction, but that was the kind of placeholder subject. It was really quite late in the day where I decided I'm going to focus on Abiy as the central character. I mean, it was always obvious that he was the central character, but that I really wanted to structure it chronologically and in terms of the narrative around his rise, and I sort of started to see the ways in which his story is in a way quite emblematic of the country's story over the last several decades, I mean, it really maps quite neatly onto that history. I mean, he's born pretty much the year of the 1974 revolution, which overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie and brought in the Marxist
The
military
Derg, right?
regime, the Derg. And then he's, teenager when the EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, sweeps into power. He essentially joins its kind of youth wing, or joins the army at this point. Then, in very shortly after that, he's fighting in the 1998 to 2000 war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. He's there, and
And
he's
he's a
also kind
line
of
a line sort of officer at the time, right?
yes, exactly. And he's become. I mean, he's sociologically as well. He's quite representative of this rising group of ethnic Oromos, the largest, most numerous ethnic group in the country, but historically somewhat marginalized at the kind of higher echelons of power and within the kind of the central state. He is absolutely riding that wave, which begins in the 90s, where they experience kind of unprecedented economic advancement, socioeconomic mobility. They have a kind of explicit representation within the ruling coalition, the EPRDF. And he's also, even more generally, kind of representative of the really rapid urbanization of this period, where people moving from the rural areas to big cities like Addis Ababa, which are growing really, really fast, particularly after 2000, 2005. He's someone who moves from the countryside to the city. So he's part of that big epochal story. He's also, and I suspect we'll come on to this more specifically, but he's also representative of the transformation of the country's religious makeup.
Just the rise of Abiy himself is a fascinating story, but the motivations of the man, and you definitely don't pull any punches as regards Abiy, which is probably why you are no longer in Ethiopia. You've called him a Pentecostal Putin and a, quote, man burning in his conviction of manifest destiny, unquote. And you also describe him as a shapeshifter, a self-help guru, CEO, military commander, and frankly, an aspiring monarch. He tries to embody all of these things all at once. Help us understand who this man is, what drives him.
Yeah, I mean, that's, one of the reasons why I did decide to hone in on him and put him really front and center is he is this extraordinarily enigmatic figure, incredibly kind of colorful. He is, on the surface, when he comes to power, he is this kind of young, kind of relatively liberal. People often describe him as a technocrat. Not sure where that came from, really. I wouldn't describe him as a technocrat, though. He has a clear fascination with kind of with technologies of the future.
Right.
He's described himself to one journalist who interviewed him as a kind of a Bay Area kind of guy. He's been to the West Coast, and Silicon Valley seems to really fascinate him, and he's done a lot with this administration, aesthetically, but also more substantively in terms of trying to put AI and other modern surveillance technologies as well at the center of the wiring of the government. So there's that side of him as well. I mean, look, all substantive political figures can be described as a bundle of contradictions. I don't think any leader who lasts as long as he so far has and come as far as he has is going to be kind of completely denuded of substance. He is widely mocked by fellow Ethiopians for the occasionally comical statements he makes, and some of the publication. He has a series of books that he's written which kind of espouse his doctrine, which certainly intellectuals in Ethiopia do not regard very highly. And of course, he's also led in my view, extremely repressive government, which has waged numerous kind of wars. So there's many who would just dismiss him as an outright warmonger and war criminal. The latter part clearly, I think, may well be true. But I did want to try and illuminate what else is going on there, because I do think he has a distinctive vision for Ethiopia. It might not be a vision that we, or frankly these days, many Ethiopians think is a compelling one for the country as a whole. Might think it's intellectually shallow or incoherent. even.
Right.
There is something there. And I've been trying to, one of the points I try to make is that you can see a kind of you can trace a through line. I mean, I've obviously interviewed many people who've known him for a long time and worked with him for a long time, but also if you read his public statements, his books, and all of this different output, you can see certain things. And it's a highly distinctive kind of idiosyncratic vision for Ethiopia, where he is sort of the embodiment of the change he wants to see in the country as a whole. Like, it's a individualist ethos in a country which has been defined historically by a more collectivist ethos in economics, for example. But he believes that, I think, in something of a self-help guru. I think I certainly have described him as, in a country which in the last 15 years or so has become really kind of enthralled to all these sort of self-help gurus and positive thinking and all of this. It's distinctively his vision, and he is the embodiment of it, and he is the singular agent of transformation. So he's indispensable. Basically, he sets the kind of moral example that everyone must follow.
Right.
And
Do
they
you
can
think, I mean,
ride.
is there almost like an MBS and Saudi? Are there sort of a linkage between the two in terms of how they view themselves as, an embodiment of transformation in their state?
Yes, no, I agree with that. I think actually more than MBS, though, more than Mohammed bin Salman, I would point to Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates, who he had a really strong personal bond with, but also exactly that. They are both kind of restless modernizers who see themselves as agents of a historic transformation to reshape their countries and their neighborhoods in their own image. Both of them also are interested in the same technologies of the future as the way to deliver that as well.
Let's focus on the prosperity gospel piece, because I think a lot of listeners, and particularly those who spent time in West Africa, can certainly attest to driving down any highway in Port Harcourt or Lagos or wherever it may be, and we'll see the billboards of evangelical preachers. But you make a case that Abiy is a deeply devoted practitioner. Help us understand that and how that sort of engages with his political philosophy and how he uses religion and evangelical Christianity as part of his levers of power.
Yeah, I mean, I was just in Ghana recently, and I have to say there is no country I've ever been to where prosperity gospel is more publicly omnipresent than there. What was interesting to me is Ethiopia was kind of playing catch up to some degree. It
Right.
wasn't, you didn't have, at least until quite recently, the kind of self-proclaimed prophets and televangelists that are famous in West Africa and Nigeria and Ghana. But that's changing, and Abiy is absolutely at the forefront of that. I will just say, scholars of religion often point out, well, prosperity gospel is a kind of imprecise term, and Abiy isn't
Right.
from prosperity gospel church per se. But I don't think anyone would disagree that rhetorically, whether or not he explicitly espouses and identifies as a prosperity gospel evangelist, his rhetoric and it is very much that of the prosperity gospel. The idea that the kind of individual flourishing in the present on earth is a sign of kind of divine favor.
Right.
That can apply to the country as a whole. So a country that is materially prosperous is one that is also spiritually wealthy as well. So that kind of connection between the kind of the material and the spiritual is something that is at the heart of his worldview, and also prosperity gospel generally. He therefore has, and give you the most kind of concrete example, and this is why I really do think, I have said this in the book, I don't think there's anyone in the world who is a more kind of zealous practitioner of prosperity gospel as statecraft and economic policy. Actually, it is Abiy Ahmed is the transformation today of Addis Ababa, which has been, I mean, it was started when I was living there. It's actually been accelerated significantly since I left. But he's essentially totally demolished and rebuilt the city as this sort of, I mean, I think it's best described as a sort of aspirational Dubai or Gulf,
Right.
kind of gleaming Gulf
Right.
metropolis.
The more glass and the more steel, the better, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the city on the shining city on the hill that he is trying to build, which therefore is also, he said this very explicitly actually in an interview with the Financial Times in 2019. He said, if you start actually not even just with, he said if you start with Addis, rebuilding Addis and making
Right.
it a kind of beautiful, well-ordered city, the rest of the country will follow, which is a kind of interesting theory of change.
Right.
That's the way he sees it. His view in a more material sense or concrete sense is that when investors or tourists arrive in the city and they drive down the main thoroughfare from the airport, they will see this gleaming, clean, tidy capital, and they'll think, I want to invest here. This is, and I think a lot of this probably comes from some of the self-help guru sort of stuff as
Sure.
well. I mean, I don't dispute that probably does have an effect, but I think it's a little bit superficial in terms of understanding what drives, investment. But there's something in it to a
Right.
degree, for
The
sure.
anti-Lagos, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm sure people. It does impress people. I'm sure. More
Right.
critically, someone recently, a recent returning visitor said it was like the Truman Show, which is
Right.
everything
Right.
felt
Right.
kind of and
Potemkin Avenue from the
yeah,
airport. Right.
kind of
Yeah.
the Potemkin criticism is being made. But yeah, I I think if you want to understand the role of prosperity gospel and this idea that like something beautiful and flourishing in temporal world is a sign of divine blessing, and
Right.
therefore and similarly that a country that is materially prosperous is also blessed by God. I think look at Addis for clear.
Right.
There's no clearer
Right.
evidence than there is in Addis
Right.
today.
You alluded to this earlier, but you offer some pretty telling quotes in the book that makes it clear that Abe is you know, people say one thing and then out of the other side of their mouth express strong opinions about him and his credibility as a leader, and that those around him in his circle of power are there purely for self-interest, right, as opposed to being real adherents of this messianic worldview. Just how solid is Abe's authority?
Good question. I am on the whole I err towards um uh a certain caution when I say, Abby's authority might be fraying or that he is sort of structurally weak. I think right now he has crucially as far as we know, he has the security apparatus of the central state securely under his thumb. Within the kind of bubble of Addis Ababa and the central core of Ethiopia, he is secure. The ruling party, which he transformed from the EPRDF coalition into a single party built in his own image, which he has kind of absolute central control over. The Prosperity Party, I should have mentioned that earlier. The name is obviously quite telling as well. All of that, as far as we can tell, he has pretty strong, a firm handover. But I've certainly spoken to people within the Prosperity Party, including people really, really close to him, who in private talk unbelievably badly of him. I mean, when I said that Ethiopia's going to mock some of his kind of pronouncements, treat him as a kind of intellectual lightweight or gadfly or whatever. I mean, I've heard some of the worst from people close to him, actually. But the reality is, and this is sort of where I conclude the book, is if he is not loved anymore, he is certainly feared. I mean, he
Sure.
has.
Right.
And a part of that fear stems from the fact that he's seen as unpredictable. No one wants to fall foul of him, but also because the repression, kind of retaliation against people and their families, allies and their families who turn against him, particularly those who do so publicly, it can be really, really harsh. And
Right.
I've had real difficulties trying to coax people into speaking, even people outside of the country who are not, cannot really be touched by him. They feared for their relatives back home. So I think
Right.
that level of fear, and I think that the Pentecostal Putin point. I mean, I think he is a Putin-like in that key part of his biography, which we haven't touched on yet, is that he comes up through the intelligence apparatus. I mean, he is
Right.
essentially a spook, cyber intelligence, and he knows where the bodies are buried.
Mhm.
That's very, very evident. People are clearly very afraid of being exposed or blackmailed or whatever it is. I mean, he also, he is like Putin or like a monarch. He is excellent at the courtly politics, at managing the kind of pre-modern court. He plays people of factions and individuals against each other. It's remarkable how few people, despite what I know to be misgivings at the very least they have about the trajectory of the country under him, how few people have resigned. I always
Sure.
found that absolutely fascinating. Only about a small handful of kind of big public principled resignations. Everyone, you always hear about how very senior figures, very senior allies have been trying to resign for years, and basically you do not resign.
Right.
You are given permission to leave at a time of the prime minister's
Right.
choosing. But back to your point about his authority, I think assume that he remains in Addis Ababa, and I'm not talking about the control over the whole of the country because the state remains weak in vast swathes of the country. But when it comes to Addis Ababa and his position in the palace, I think I haven't yet been given compelling evidence that anything has changed on that front, even
Sure.
if his popularity as a country as a whole has dipped significantly. The question really is, what point does that change if potentially another military adventure gone wrong, or the economy is another big important variable that may prove at some point the straw that breaks the camel's back. But right now, I think Abiy enjoys more executive power within the areas under federal government control than any leader in Ethiopian history since at least the imperial era.
Sure. Sure. Well, you allude there to some worrying signs about state control outside of Addis, and you've recently written about this. Some worrisome conflict markers. How close is Ethiopia? And I think this goes to the Horn, but to renewed national conflict. What
Right.
indicators concern you the most right now?
Yeah. So I tried to kind of raise the alarm a few weeks ago in The Economist with the leader basically saying, look, the peace agreement, the Pretoria agreement, which ended the Tigray war between 2020 and 2022 is at best unraveling, is at worst already dead. Tigrayans basically say that they are ready to return to the battlefield. The provisions of the agreement are not being implemented. Abiy is quite clearly, and has been, I think, for a long time, been pretty uninterested in forcing through the trickier provisions of the agreement. I think crucially, there's been a radical reconfiguring of alliances within the region. Just to refresh your listeners,
Please walk us through that sort of conflict system there in the Horn.
the Tigray war pitted Abiy and his then ally in Eritrea, President Isaias Afwerki, and their respective forces against the Tigrayan leadership, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, in this kind of apocalyptic war that killed hundreds of thousands. On the federal government and the Eritrean side was also the forces from the Amhara region, which is a region with historic rivalries next to the Tigray region. Since the Pretoria Agreement, that's all kind of flipped. The Amhara turned against Abiy. Amhara is the second largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, was, let's say, had a tactical alliance with Abiy early on in his administration because he kind of was essentially offering them certain of the kind of policy priorities that they wanted. And then after the Pretoria Agreement, that relationship completely ruptured and a revolt began. So that was the first thing. I mean, that was the first sign that the peace agreement was really kind of laying the seeds for future conflicts. Then the relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea is extremely complicated. There was this historic peace agreement between between Abiy and President Isaias in 2018, which Abiy got the Nobel Peace Prize for. But that was always a short-term security pact, an alliance against the Tigrayans. And then when Abiy made peace with the Tigrayans in 2022, President Isaias, that accelerated what was already a kind of a certain distancing between those two leaders. Now, just to move us up to speed, today, the Eritreans, President Isaias, have been getting closer and closer to their old enemy, the Tigrayans. The Amhara, also an old enemy of the Tigrayans. they are now also appearing to draw closer, potentially even forging a kind of military alliance, a kind of three-way military alliance, a very unlikely, I should say, hugely unlikely military alliance between the Tigrayans, the Amharas, and the Eritreans. The exact kind of scope and scale of their alliance is not yet quite fully clear, but I'm very, very confident that it is meaningful at this point, and that would pit them against potential. And also, I should throw in even rebels as well from Abiy's own ethnic group, the Oromo, who have been, you know, rebelling against Abiy's government for longer than anyone, actually, since 2018. They too could be part of this axis, which is emerging, a kind of anti-Abiy axis. So that what we see here is the potential for a conflict, which would involve a number of different actors across the region, centered again on Tigray, because as this peace agreement has showed worrying signs of breaking down, you see the possibility of renewed conflict between Abiy's government and the Tigrayans, or a large faction of the Tigrayans, who themselves have also splintered since the peace agreement, but let's not go into that. And then new allies being the Amhara, the Oromo, and then, crucially, the Eritreans as well, being drawn back into Tigray for another conflict, this time no longer on Abiy's side, but against him. We were sounding the alarm because we think this kind of conflict would be devastating, but what it would mean for Abiy's position in Addis Ababa is a question. Is a
Right.
question I don't know the answer to, but I suspect it would weaken him.
We could go down the doom loop here, because I think there are so many ethnic and political and other factors that are worrisome about Ethiopia. But it's also has the fastest growing GDPs and an enormous population. Tell us what gives you hope, and particularly for investors. I mean, doing business in Ethiopia and keeping your head below the parapet of high politics is, I think, probably what most companies would want to do. But tell us some of what gives you hope about Ethiopia, and particularly for Western investors who may be thinking, we want to be part of this growth story.
Look, I mean, Ethiopia was long one of Africa's most state-controlled economies. And in the last few years, and particularly actually since I wrote the book, because I was quite skeptical in the book that the liberalization story was quite what it was cracked up to be. I think in the last year, really, since they floated the burr about exactly a year, well, just over a year ago, and then sort of subsequently entered an IMF program worth about 3.4 billion, 3% of GDP. IMF definitely does, is enthusiastic. Take that. That is, I mean, they have skepticism privately, but questions privately, but I think they do see an exciting, potentially very exciting story. A raft of reforms are underway, which will radically alter its economic system. People compare it to the transition economies after the fall of the Soviet Union. Ethiopia wants to follow the path of some of countries like Poland, become a major economic power. It has obvious advantages, the demographic one, huge population. One of the factors which drew investors, particularly when I arrived there and before conflict really exploded, was wages were comparably low. So if you were moving if you're a factory, a garment manufacturer, for example, looking to move beyond Southeast Asia from Vietnam or even Bangladesh to somewhere where the cost of labor was lower, Ethiopia was an obvious spot. You had a government, and I think still a government, which is very focused to a degree that is possibly unusual within the region, unusually focused on the kind of developmental path and modernization. You have cheap power. Ethiopia is
Exactly.
today
Grand
has
Renaissance and
Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam, which was now fully complete this year, and that's going to be producing theoretically cheap energy, not just for Ethiopia consumers, businesses, but will be exported to the rest of the region as well. The big issue, really, more than anything, is stability. I worry as well about kind of corruption. People fear that it might be going in the direction of, let's say, neighboring Kenya. But neighboring Kenya is still one of the most attractive places to invest in Africa. A degree of let's say, rent seeking is not necessarily inconsistent or incompatible with growth. I hope Ethiopia's state and political economy is more conducive to growth than Kenya, and I think it can still be. But I just to go back to some of these seismic reforms. I mean, it's opening up banking, retail, in particular, to other to foreign competition.
Right, Safaricom making its entry into the market. And
Yeah, exactly. Relax restrictions on repatriating profits. That was also a massive thing when I first arrived there. That was a big thing that investors struggled with. Owning property now. I mean, there's obviously privatization of state-owned firms. There's a stock exchange. I mean, so in that respect, it's a liberalization story that is probably unmatched anywhere on the continent. It is being hobbled by politics, and is for me the top line.
that's a takeaway.
Issue.
Yeah, no, that's a great takeaway.
Longer term, but my point being, longer term, there should be some grounds to be bullish.
Right. I mean, the structural forces, right? Just the size of the population and, like you say, the natural resources in terms of energy and such. Well, Tom, I'd love to shift now to talk about Kenya, of course, but I think that's for another episode. As a last question, I always ask guests to provide our listeners 1 to 2 books that they would, if they really want to go deeper, that they think that they should add to their nightstand. Fiction, nonfiction. What should our listeners take a look at in terms of going deeper on the Ethiopia story?
I would recommend a couple of fiction books. Well, actually, they're novels, but then neither of them are really fully fictional. The first one's called The Wife's Tale by Ida Edamariam, who's a journalist with The Guardian, I believe. Her mother her grandmother. She reconstructs the life of her late grandmother growing up in Ethiopia. So it takes in the kind of feudal regime of Emperor Haile Selassie, the Marxist dictatorship under the Derg. It's basically the sweep of Ethiopian 20th century history, which I really cannot stress how fascinating Ethiopian 20th century history is, and through this very intimate personal story. And the other one is a book called Orome by Balu Girma, which is a kind of 1980s political satire, which cost the author its life, actually, but it's been translated into English for the first time, I believe earlier this year.
Wonderful.
Or last year. It's now available in English, and it's basically a fictionalized account of Ethiopia's failed attempt in the 1980s to suppress a separatist uprising in what was then the province of Eritrea. So if you're interested in the relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea and the potential for history repeating itself, which one of my great worries, that I think this is it's funny and dark, and for anyone who's kind of familiar with Ethiopian politics today, a lot of it feels all too familiar. But it would be my 2.
So Orome and The Wife's Tale, and we'll put those into the show notes, of course. Well, Tom Gardner, thank you so much for joining us today. The book is The Abiy Project: God, Power, and War in the New Ethiopia. Absolutely fascinating read. Can't recommend it more highly. And like I said, I think we need to have you on to shift focus, maybe head south to talk about Kenya. Tom, thank you so much for giving us so much time today.
Thanks very much, Todd. Thanks for inviting me.